In my 35 years on the bench in Providence, I've seen every kind of excuse a person can bring into a courtroom, every kind of fear, every kind of regret, every kind of pride. But the morning that young man walked in wearing a suit worth more than some people's monthly rent, carrying himself like the law was just another employee on his father's payroll, I felt something in the air change. If this touches your heart, leave a comment, because what happened that day reminded me why justice has to be firm, but never lose its soul. He came in late. That told me something before he even said a word. Most people who come into my courtroom, even if they're upset, even if they think the ticket is unfair, they come in nervous. They stand carefully. They look around. They hold the paper with both hands. They know the courtroom matters. They know this is serious. But this young man came in like he was entering a hotel lobby that had made a mistake with his reservation. Inspector Quinn glanced at me and he didn't have to say a thing. After all those years together, sometimes a look says more than language. His face told me, "Judge, this one thinks he's different." The clerk called the case. 3 citations: illegal parking in a handicapped zone, failure to obey a traffic officer, disorderly conduct arising from an incident outside a medical office building. Nothing glamorous. The kind of ordinary municipal matter people think is too small to matter. But let me tell you something, my friends. The small cases are where character shows up in full size. The young man stepped forward and adjusted his cufflinks while his lawyer stood beside him. That too I noticed. Not because a lawyer is unusual. People have every right to representation, but because the lawyer looked worried and the young man looked amused. I asked his name. He gave me his full name slowly, clearly, like he expected recognition to move through the room. And it did. People in Providence knew the family. His father had towers downtown, charity galas, foundation dinners, ribbon cuttings, a billionaire, one of those men whose last name sits on buildings higher than most people's hopes. The son was in the papers too, young executive, fast rising. Talk of a future in politics, maybe a board appointment, maybe something bigger. Good hair, perfect smile, expensive confidence, the kind the world often mistakes for substance. I looked down at the citations again. Then I looked back up at him. "Sir," I said, "do you wish to contest these matters?" He smiled, not warmly, not respectfully, just confidently. His lawyer leaned in to speak, but the young man spoke first. "Your Honor, my office intends to pursue a civil action for unlawful treatment, selective enforcement, and reputational harm." You could feel the room stiffen. Sometimes you hear words and you know they're not really for the court. They're for the audience, for the clerks, for the cameras in a person's imagination. He wasn't just defending himself, he was performing power. I folded my hands. "Is that so?" I said. "Yes," he answered. "This entire incident was mishandled. I was targeted, delayed, embarrassed in public, and I intend to hold the city accountable. If necessary, the court as well. Now, I've been doing this for 35 years. When someone threatens me personally in my courtroom, I don't hear danger. I hear weakness. Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Real dignity doesn't kick doors and rattle windows. Still, I kept my voice calm, because the robe is not armor against humanity. It's a responsibility to control it. I said, "Let me ask you something. Are you here to resolve these citations, or are you here to intimidate this court?" The smile on his face didn't disappear, but it tightened a little. His lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is simply preserving his rights." "Good," I said. "Then let's preserve everyone's rights, including the right of this court to hear facts before speeches." A few people in the gallery shifted. I heard one faint chuckle. Inspector Quinn looked down to hide his smile. "If you believe respect should matter, no matter how much money somebody has, hit that like button, because what happened next told me exactly what kind of morning this was going to be." I asked for the ticketing officer's statement. A municipal traffic officer named Rosa Delgado had written the citations. I knew Rosa by face. Hard-working woman, never dramatic, widowed, if I remembered correctly, quiet, the kind of person who does her job and goes home without asking the world to applaud her for it. Her report said the defendant parked his black sports car in a handicapped space directly in front of a medical building, then ignored repeated instructions to move. When told he would be cited, he allegedly laughed, asked whether she knew who he was, then said she'd be looking for employment by the end of the week. The young man shook his head before I even finished reading. "That's absurd," he said. "I was stopped for less than 5 minutes." I looked at him. "In a handicapped space. It was temporary." I leaned back slightly. "So is life." That landed in the room, not because it was dramatic, because it was true. He looked at me like he wasn't used to people answering him in complete sentences that he couldn't buy his way around. His lawyer tried again. Your Honor, if I may, my client had an urgent matter involving his mother's physician. Now, when I hear the word mother, I pay attention. I come from an immigrant family. My father sold milk and fruit from a pushcart. My mother taught me dignity before I ever understood the law. So, if a person tells me he was trying to help his mother, that matters to me. Family matters to me. Duty matters to me. I soften my tone. Is your mother ill? I asked. The young man nodded once. Yeah, she had an appointment in the building. There it was. A possible reason, a possible human story beneath the arrogance, and I'm always looking for that because everybody has a story, sometimes buried, sometimes broken, sometimes wrapped in anger, but still there. So I asked, why didn't you say that first? He answered, because I shouldn't have to justify being harassed by a parking officer. And just like that, the human door opened an inch and slammed shut again. I felt that familiar disappointment judges feel but rarely talk about. Not anger, sadness. Because mercy needs something to work with. It needs honesty. It needs humility. It needs at least a crack in the wall. I asked the clerk if the officer was present. She was. Rosa Delgado stepped forward with the careful posture of somebody who has spent her whole life trying not to inconvenience anyone. Mid-50s, plain coat, tired eyes, hands folded so tightly I could see the strain in her fingers. She wasn't afraid of the facts. She was afraid of the room. That told me something too. I said, "Ma'am, take your time." She nodded. Then she looked at the young man, and I saw her gather herself before she spoke. Your Honor, I asked him politely 3 times to move the vehicle. There were 2 handicapped patients waiting to unload. One was an older gentleman with an oxygen tank. The other was a child in a wheelchair van. I told him I understood he was in a hurry, but the space was reserved. He told me I should go write tickets somewhere people matter. The room went quiet in a different way then, not the silence of surprise, the silence of recognition, because everybody in that room knew what she meant. They'd all heard some version of that sentence in their lives. Somewhere people matter, as though some people count and some people are decorations. The young man's lawyer leaned in and whispered urgently to him. The young man whispered back without taking his eyes off Rosa. I asked, "Did you say that, sir?" "No," he replied immediately. Did you tell her she'd be out of a job?" "No." Rosa looked down, not because she doubted herself, because being called a liar by the powerful is exhausting when you've spent your whole life telling the truth. My throat tightened a little. That happens sometimes. I'm not ashamed of it. Age teaches you that strength and tenderness are not enemies. I asked if there was any additional documentation. The prosecutor handed up photographs. I looked at them closely. The black sports car was angled across most of the handicapped space and part of the loading zone. Hazard lights on, custom plates, no placard, no permit, and in one photograph just at the edge, I saw the back doors of a wheelchair van still closed because there wasn't enough room to open them. That photograph showed me everything I needed to know about the law, but not yet everything I needed to know about the person. Before I tell you what I decided in that moment, subscribe to see more stories like this, because sometimes the biggest lessons in a courtroom come from the cases people think are too small to remember. I asked Rosa one more question. Did the defendant ever move the car? She nodded. After I told him I was issuing the citation. How long did it take? About 7 minutes total from first contact. The young man gave a dismissive laugh. 7 minutes. We're doing this over 7 minutes. I looked right at him. Sir, if your grandmother needed that space, it would not be 7 minutes to you. He opened his mouth, then shut it. I've learned over the decades that a judge doesn't always need to talk more. Sometimes the truth needs a little room to sit down in a person's chest. Then I noticed something else. Rosa still seemed shaken, more shaken than the average parking dispute would explain. I asked gently, "Ma'am, is there anything else you want the court to know?" She hesitated. That hesitation mattered. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly. "You're not causing trouble," I said. "You're answering a question." She swallowed hard. When he drove off, he rolled the window down and said, "You people always think these little uniforms make you important. You people." I have heard that phrase in 100 forms. It always arrives dressed as superiority and leaves smelling like cowardice. The lawyer stood up straighter. "Your Honor, I object to these uncorroborated allegations." "Noted," I said. Then I asked if there was any body camera footage or street video. The prosecutor said there was city surveillance from the building entrance, no audio but visual coverage. They hadn't intended to rely on it because the citations themselves were straightforward. Bring it up, I said. The young man shifted for the first time. Now, I've been on television long enough to know some people walk into court more worried about what's on a screen than what's in their soul. But truth has a way of showing up from angles pride forgets to cover. As the clerk worked to pull up the footage, I looked again at the young man. Perfect suit, perfect watch, perfect posture, but now his jaw had tightened, his left foot tapped once. People reveal themselves in the details, sometimes more in the body than in the mouth. The video came on, no audio, just the sidewalk in front of the medical building. We watched his car pull in. We watched Rosa approach. We watched him gesture dismissively. We watched another vehicle circle. We watched the wheelchair van arrive and stop behind him. We watched Rosa speak again. We watched him turn away, check his phone, smile at something, and lean back against the car while she continued talking. Then came the part that made the whole courtroom lean forward. The van driver got out and tried the rear door. It opened only a few inches before hitting the angle of the sports car. Rosa motioned to the defendant urgently. He shrugged. Actually shrugged, not imagined, not described. There it was, a shrug. Somebody in the gallery let out a breath. I felt heat in my chest, but I kept my face still. A judge has to be careful. We're not there to perform outrage. We're there to make justice visible without making ego visible. The young man's lawyer whispered again, but this time there was no confidence in it, just damage control. Then the video showed something unexpected. An elderly man with an oxygen tank sat in the passenger seat of another car, waiting behind the van. He tried to step out, but there wasn't room. He sat back down, his head dropped slightly. He looked tired, not angry, just tired. That broke my heart in a very quiet way, because injustice is often not a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it is just one tired old man waiting for a space somebody else decided his life didn't need. I asked the prosecutor if the elderly man had been identified. He said no, but the van driver and building manager had both been interviewed. The young man suddenly spoke. This is ridiculous. Are we really turning a parking misunderstanding into a morality play? I answered him softly. No, sir. You did that when you decided convenience outranked everybody else's dignity. That was the first time he looked truly offended, not by the law, by equality. Let me tell you something, my friends. There are people who can accept being told they're wrong, and there are people who experience accountability as an insult. When I see the second kind, I know I'm not dealing only with a citation. I'm dealing with a life lesson that somehow never arrived. I asked him again, did you know your vehicle was blocking access for a wheelchair van? He hesitated. I knew I was there briefly. That's not what I asked. He looked at his lawyer, then back at me. I saw a van, and I assumed they could wait. There it was. Not an excuse. A world view. I didn't speak for a moment. Sometimes silence is the only proper respect for a terrible answer. Inspector Quinn shifted behind me. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes. I thought of my father. He worked hard every day and treated every person, rich or poor, like they had a name worth using. We didn't have money. We had decency. And I've often said I try to treat people the way I would want my own family treated. But I also try to ask, how would my father want me to respond when someone has forgotten what being human looks like? The answer is never humiliation for sport. It is truth with consequences. Before the next turn in this story, share this if you know someone who needs hope, because justice doesn't only show up when the innocent cry. Sometimes it shows up when the proud are finally forced to listen. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Why were you there that morning, sir? He seemed relieved to get back to his prepared explanation. I brought my mother to an appointment. What kind of appointment? He frowned. That's private. I nodded. Of course it is, but you're asking this court to see you as a devoted son acting under stress. If that's your mitigation, I'm allowed to understand it. He pressed his lips together. It was a consultation. For what? He glanced at the lawyer again. Cardiac treatment. Now the room softened. Even I softened. Because sickness in a family rearranges people. Fear makes people foolish. Love makes people frantic. That is true in every neighborhood, every income bracket, every language. I said, all right, was she inside the building at the time this occurred? Yes. Alone? No, with an assistant. Then why didn't the assistant remain with the car? He didn't answer right away. His lawyer stepped in. Your Honor, the details of staffing arrangements are not relevant. Sometimes lawyers think relevance belongs only to law books. In a courtroom, relevance also lives in credibility. I said, it's relevant if the defense is urgency. The young man sighed, irritated now. Because I didn't expect to be stopped. I was walking her in. Then why does the officer report that you were leaning against the vehicle? Using your phone? No answer. The lawyer spoke again. The video lacks context. I nodded. That is true. Video often does. But context usually helps the truthful more than the deceptive. I asked if the mother was present in court. No, she was not. I asked whether the assistant had provided a statement. No. I asked whether there was any medical verification of the appointment. The lawyer paused. Not with us today. There are moments in court where a case begins with one shape and slowly reveals another. This was one of those moments. I could feel it. Not because I had supernatural instincts, because decades of listening teaches you the difference between a rough truth and a polished lie. Then the prosecutor asked permission to add one more point. I granted it. He said the disorderly conduct notation had not arisen merely from verbal abuse. According to the building manager, after receiving the citation, the defendant had entered the lobby and demanded surveillance footage be deleted. When told it could not be released without a request, he allegedly said, "My father owns half this city. Don't make me prove it." Now I understood why Rosa had been trembling. This wasn't just rudeness. What it was, domination, a habit of moving through ordinary people like they were furniture. The young man laughed once sharply. That's hearsay. Much of court begins with what somebody says happened, I replied. And we examine whether is it to certain its son. He looked directly at me then, and for the first time the polite mask dropped away. With all due respect, Judge, this is exactly why people sue cities like this. Petty officials with small power trying to make examples out of people who don't bow to them. You could have heard a pin drop. I have seen anger, grief, panic, addiction, shame, desperation. I can usually locate the wound beneath behavior, but entitlement is a harder thing. It often arrives wrapped in intelligence, dressed in success, backed by institutions, and it can rot a soul without leaving visible bruises. Still, I leaned forward and kept my voice measured. Sir, let me ask you something. Do you think this court exists so people bow to me? He didn't answer. This court exists so the weak and the strong come into one room and answer to the same rules. He looked away. I continued. A courtroom is one of the few places left where a janitor and a billionaire should stand the same height before the law. If that offends you, the problem is not the court. I saw people in the gallery nodding. Rosa's eyes filled slightly, but she blinked it back, and the lawyer requested a recess. I denied it, not to be harsh, to prevent a performance from regrouping into a strategy. Then something happened I didn't expect. An older man in the back row stood up. He carried a portable oxygen tank. He raised a trembling hand and said, "Your Honor, I think I was there." The bailiff moved immediately, but I held up a hand. "Sir, were you subpoenaed?" "No, Judge. I came for my own ticket, but that video, I was the man in the car." Now my heart beat a little harder, because truth sometimes walks into court uninvited, wearing old shoes and carrying an oxygen tube. I had him sworn in. He gave his name, Salvatore Mancini, 81 years old, retired machinist, lung disease, appointment that morning in the same building. I asked him what he remembered. He smiled sadly. "I remember not wanting trouble." That line hit me hard because in all my years on the bench, the people who least deserve hardship are often the most eager not to burden anyone with it. He pointed gently toward the young man. "That fellow there, he was told to move. He didn't want to. My daughter was driving me. She said, 'Dad, just wait.' I told her, 'Don't argue, honey.' Then the lady officer kept trying and the van behind us couldn't open. I watched the little girl in the back seat crying because she thought she was late. The young man's face changed then, not to remorse, to annoyance that reality had become crowded. Salvatore continued. The officer was respectful. The young man wasn't. He kept waving his hand like we were all interrupting his day. Then the old man said something that I still remember word for word. 'Judge, I've been poor, and I've been sicker than poor. But the worst feeling is when somebody with everything looks at you like you're in the way.' I had to pause, not for drama, because I'm human, and when an old man speaks that much truth that plainly a courtroom ought to have the decency to let the words settle. If this story means something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me whether you think justice should only punish or whether sometimes it should teach, because what I was thinking in that moment surprised even me. I wasn't thinking about the fine anymore. I was thinking about formation, about how a person becomes the kind of man who can see an elderly stranger waiting for oxygen and still protect a parking spot like it's a throne. I asked the young man a very simple question. "Did you hear what he just said?" He replied, "I heard his version." I closed my eyes for one brief second. That's when I knew money had done what sometimes money does when it isn't balanced by gratitude. It had insulated him from consequence so long that he mistook other people's pain for opinion. The prosecutor recommended the standard penalties on all citations. The lawyer argued selective enforcement, lack of audio, and emotional embellishment. Then the young man made his mistake, not the parking, not the threats, not even the arrogance. The mistake that ended his career came in one sentence. He said, "Frankly, Your Honor, if this court wants to make a spectacle out of a successful family, we can make one back. My father has resources. We don't lose fights like this." There are words that reveal more than evidence ever could. We don't lose fights like this. Not I didn't do it. Not I was helping my mother. Not I'm sorry the access was blocked. We don't lose fights like this. In that instant, the whole case stood naked. This was not about truth. It was about winning. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the lawyer, who now seemed to understand he was standing next to a collapsing building. I looked at Rosa. I looked at Mr. Mancini with his oxygen. I looked at Inspector Quinn, and I thought of every frightened single mother, every tired senior, every immigrant who ever stood in front of me hoping the law still had a heart and a spine. I spoke slowly, and I meant every word. "Sir, money can buy representation. It can buy buildings, headlines, and good tailoring, but it cannot buy decency. And if you have spent your life believing otherwise, today is going to be expensive in ways no invoice can measure." You could feel the air shift. He stared at me. I continued. "You threatened a city worker for doing her job. You blocked access for people whose need outweighed your convenience. You treated ordinary citizens as obstacles, and now you stand here not with remorse but with a warning." I leaned forward. "Let me tell you something. A warning only works if the person receiving it is afraid. I am not." That line moved through the room like a current. Not because it was theatrical, because sometimes people need to hear that institutions still have bones. The lawyer whispered urgently, then finally said the words he should have said much earlier. "Your Honor, my client would like an opportunity to apologize." I looked at the young man. "No," he snapped. "No, not to the officer, not to the old man, not to the child in the van he delayed. No, pride is a terrible prison because the door is unlocked from the inside. Now I had a decision to make. Part of judging is law. Another part is calibration. How do I impose a consequence that serves justice without feeding ego? How do I punish the act without abandoning the possibility of redemption? I never want my courtroom to become a place where I simply crush people for applause. That's not justice. That's vanity in a robe. I thought of my father again. He would have said, "Son, don't confuse hardness with strength." So I took a breath. Then I made my ruling on the citations. Guilty on the parking violation. Guilty on failure to obey the officer. Guilty on the disorderly conduct finding tied to intimidation of municipal personnel, based on the totality of testimony and evidence before the court. The young man shook his head in disbelief. The fines were significant but not devastating to someone from his background, and that's what bothered me. A fine only matters if it reaches the conscience. For some people, $100 hurts. For others, $1,000 is lunch money. Justice that only measures pain in dollars risks becoming comedy for the rich. So before I finalized disposition, I asked whether the court had authority, with consent and in lieu of additional penalties, to impose structured community service through the city's accessibility assistance program. The prosecutor said yes. The lawyer looked alarmed. The young man looked insulted. I said, "Here is what I am going to do with you." He opened his mouth. I raised a hand. "No, now you're going to listen." The room was still. "For 30 weekends, you will report to the Providence Accessibility Transportation Volunteer Program. You will assist seniors and disabled residents entering and exiting vehicles, carrying paperwork, opening doors, and learning what inconvenience actually looks like when your body has stopped negotiating with you. You will do it without press, without staff, without chauffeur, without social media, without your father's name. If you fail, every available fine will be reinstated at maximum." He turned bright red. "That's absurd." "No," I said. "What's absurd is that this lesson has been delayed this long." The lawyer objected. I overruled him. The young man said, "You can't humiliate me like this." And that's when I gave the response people would later repeat 1,000,000 times. "Sir, being asked to help the people you ignored is not humiliation. It is education." Even now, that sentence stays with me because it came from the deepest part of what I believe. Mercy without truth is weakness, and truth without mercy is cruelty. The law is not merely there to punish the poor and inconvenience the rich, it is there to remind all of us that our lives touch each other. I added one more condition. You will also make a formal written apology to Officer Delgado and to the building staff you attempted to intimidate. It will not be drafted by counsel, it will be drafted by you, and if I read one sentence that sounds like it came from a public relations office, you'll do it again. A sound came from the gallery then. Not laughter? Relief. I saw Rosa cover her mouth with one hand. The young man stared at me like nobody had ever spoken to him, as though he were both responsible and still worth saving, because that is the balance I try to strike. Accountability with a door left open. I wasn't finished. I said, and one more thing, if your mother is ill, I wish her well, truly, God bless her, but don't ever use a parent's suffering as camouflage for your own selfishness. Family is sacred. Don't drag it into a lie. That one hit him. I could see it. For the first time that morning, the arrogance cracked. Not all the way, just enough for pain to show through. He looked down. I thought maybe we were finally reaching the human being under the posture. Before I tell you what happened after that, subscribe if you believe second chances should come with responsibility, because this next part is where the story took a turn none of us in that courtroom expected. The lawyer requested to approach. I allowed it. He spoke quietly with his client for nearly a minute. Then he turned to me and said, in a different tone than before, Your Honor, my client would like the record to reflect that his mother was not in the building for an appointment. She had already been dropped off at home. He was in the building for a private breakfast meeting. The courtroom didn't gasp loudly. It inhaled. That was worse than the parking, worse than the threat, because it told me his mother's illness had been used like a prop. I looked at the young man. He would not meet my eyes. What kind of meeting, I asked. The lawyer swallowed. A meeting regarding confirmation to a philanthropic advisory board connected to disability access initiatives. That almost broke the room. Inspector Quinn looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It said, Judge, if you wrote this in a script, nobody would believe it. Here was a man blocking access for disabled residents while trying to secure a position on a disability access board. I felt both sadness and clarity. Sometimes hypocrisy is so complete it circles back into revelation. The prosecutor immediately asked that the record reflect the false statement about the mother's appointment. I granted it. Then I addressed the young man. Do you understand what you have just done? He said nothing. You did not merely park illegally. You lied to this court. You borrowed your mother's illness to clothe your selfishness. Do you understand how low that is? His shoulders dropped slightly. Not enough, but some. I continued. I have spent a lifetime looking for the good in people. I still believe it is there, but it cannot be reached through deceit. Then came another surprise. Rosa Delgado asked if she could speak. I allowed it. She turned not to me, but to the young man. Her voice shook, but it did not fail. My son is in treatment, she said. That morning was my first day back after staying nights at Hasbro with him. I still came to work. I still did my job. And when you talked to me like that, I went home and cried in my car because I was already tired. That was the moment the courtroom changed. Not because it became emotional, because it became honest. The young man finally looked at her, really looked. Maybe for the first time in his life, he saw the person standing on the other end of his convenience. She continued, You said I work somewhere people don't matter. I want you to know they matter to me. I had to pause again. That line was beautiful in a heartbreaking way. No rhetoric, no polish, just moral truth from a tired mother in a modest uniform. I said softly, Officer Delgado, thank you. Then I turned back to the defendant, and this time I wasn't speaking as a television judge or a man people knew from clips. I was speaking as the son of immigrants, as a father, as an old man who's watched thousands of lives bend under pressure. Look at her, I told him. He did. That's strength, I said. Not you. Her. He stared at Rosa. The mask was gone now. In its place was something messy, embarrassment, anger, shame. Maybe all three. He whispered, I didn't know. Rosa answered before I could. You didn't ask. That may have been the most powerful line of the day. You didn't ask. How many wounds in the world begin there? How much cruelty is simply the byproduct of never asking what the other person is carrying? If this touches your heart, leave a comment, because I believe most injustice doesn't start with hatred. It starts with the failure to care enough to ask. The lawyer asked for a brief recess again. This time, I granted it, not for strategy, but because I thought the young man needed a hallway more than a microphone. When court resumed 15 minutes later, he looked different, not transformed. I don't believe in instant sainthood, but shaken, less arranged. His tie loosened, his eyes red around the edges. He stood without being prompted. "Your Honor," he said, voice unsteady now, "I would like to apologize." I listened. "To Officer Delgado, to the gentleman who testified, to the people I delayed, and to the court. I was wrong. I've heard many apologies. Some are just legal weather. This one wasn't complete, but it was no longer fake." I asked, Why were you wrong?" He inhaled. "Because I thought my time mattered more than other people's needs, because I assumed I could talk my way out of it, and because I lied. Good, not enough, but good." "And the threat?" I asked. He looked down. "I've gotten used to people backing off when I say my father's name." There it was, the hidden engine, a young man raised too close to power and too far from correction. I said, "That may work in restaurants, sir. It will not work here." A faint laugh passed through the room, gentle and human. Then I made my final ruling official. The fines would stand in reduced form because the violations were real and the lie to the court was serious. The structured service order would remain. The letters would remain. In addition, he would return to court after 60 days with documentation of every service hour completed. I wanted no ceremonial remorse. I wanted proof. He nodded. Then unexpectedly he asked, "May I say something to Officer Delgado directly?" I looked at Rosa. She agreed. He turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I made your day harder. I'm sorry I spoke to you like you were beneath me." Rosa accepted it with a nod that was dignified, not eager. Sometimes forgiveness is not a hug. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to keep carrying somebody else's ugliness. Mr. Mancini raised a frail hand and said, "Young man, if you do the service, you might become somebody." That got a real laugh, even from me. I said, "Mr. Mancini, that may be the best sentencing recommendation I've heard all year." Court moved on, case after case, a missing registration, a school zone ticket, an expired inspection sticker, ordinary lives with ordinary struggles. But that young man stayed in my mind all day, not because I wanted him punished, but because I kept asking myself the same question: what happens when compassion arrives too late in a person's upbringing? Can a courtroom supply in an hour what a lifetime failed to teach? I didn't know. Weeks passed. And as often happens now, a clip from the courtroom made its way online. Not because I chased that. I never sat on the bench dreaming of viral moments, but people are hungry for reminders that institutions can still sound human. The clip spread. The line about education, the line about the janitor and the billionaire, Rosa's sentence, "You didn't ask." People shared it everywhere. Then the newspapers picked it up, then the bigger outlets. Then came the story behind the story. The advisory board meeting he had lied about. It was real. The organization confirmed he had been under consideration for a highly visible leadership role tied to urban accessibility and public service. By the end of the week, they withdrew his name. Another company, where he held a junior executive title, announced he would be taking an indefinite leave. Commentators called it scandal. Pundits called it reckoning. Some people celebrated his downfall a little too enthusiastically for my taste. Because let me tell you something, my friends, if justice becomes entertainment, we lose something precious. I never wanted his life destroyed. I wanted his conscience awakened. A few days later, a letter arrived in chambers, not from him, from his father. Now I've received many letters over the years. Thank yous, complaints, Christmas cards, photos of babies who once came to court strapped in car seats. But this letter was handwritten on heavy stationery and began with surprising honesty. He wrote that he had watched the clip alone in his office after friends told him he needed to see it. He wrote that he was ashamed not only of his son, but of himself. He said he had spent decades building wealth and influence while assuming character would somehow grow automatically in the house alongside comfort. He said he had confused provision with parenting. That line stayed with me. Provision with parenting. How many people make that mistake? Not just the rich, all kinds of parents. We give, we provide, we rush, we solve, we protect. But do we form? Do we interrupt selfishness before the world has to? Do we teach children to see the tired cashier, the janitor, the traffic officer, the old man waiting for oxygen? The father asked for nothing in the letter, no favor, no reduction, no private meeting, just gratitude that, in his words, someone finally told my son the truth in a room he could not dominate. I put the letter down and sat quietly for a while, because judges see the failures after they bloom. We see the addiction after the first lie, the theft after the first excuse, the cruelty after the first unchecked contempt. We are late arriving witnesses to earlier neglect. That humbles me. It also keeps me compassionate. Share this if you know someone raising children in a world that confuses success with worth, because the next time that young man came back into my courtroom, I saw something I didn't expect. 62 days later, he returned. No expensive lawyer this time, just a folder in his hands, dark suit again, but plain. No show, no performance. He looked tired in a different way, honest tired. I asked for the documentation, 30 weekends, completed, driver assist logs, accessibility center verification, senior transport signatures, letters from coordinators. I reviewed them slowly, and as I did, I noticed something else in the folder, a stack of handwritten notes from seniors and disabled residents he had helped. One note said, "Thank you for not rushing me when I couldn't get my walker through the door." Another said, "Young man, you listened to my husband tell the same war story twice and smiled both times. God bless you." Another said, "The little girl loved that you learned how to fold her chair correctly." I looked up at him. He was already crying, not dramatically, just quietly, like a person whose mirror has finally stopped lying. I asked, "How was the service?" He laughed once through the tears. "Humbling." That's a good beginning," I said. He nodded. "The first weekend I hated you." The room laughed. I smiled. "That's not new." He laughed too, then looked down. "The third weekend I met a veteran who apologized to me because it took him a long time to get out of the van. I went home and sat in my car for 20 minutes after that. I kept hearing myself saying people could wait. Now there was real remorse, because true remorse is not 'I'm sorry I got caught.' It is, 'I cannot believe the kind of person I was willing to be.'" He continued, "I thought I understood service because my family wrote checks. I didn't. I didn't understand anything. I believed him. Not because tears prove innocence, they don't, but because specificity proves contact. When someone can name the exact moment their heart began to change, I listen. I asked whether he had written the apology letters himself. He said yes. I had copies. They were imperfect, raw, no public relations department. In one line to Rosa, he wrote, "I confused your position with your value, and that is one of the ugliest things I have ever done." That sentence told me more about his progress than any polished essay could. Rosa was in court again that day by coincidence on another matter. I asked whether she wished to say anything. She stood and said, "He wrote me twice. The second time felt like the truth." That was enough for me. Mr. Mancini wasn't there, but his daughter had sent a short note through the clerk, wishing the young man better eyesight for other people. Beautiful phrase. Better eyesight for other people. I said to him, "Do you understand now why this court responded the way it did?" He answered, "Yes, Your Honor." "Tell me." He took a breath. "Because a fine would have cost me money. But service,